Welcome to the Three Things Podcast. I'm David Iglesias, Director of Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics. You may be wondering why this podcast is called Three Things. You were probably taught by your parents, like I was, that it was impolite to talk to people about three things: religion, politics, and money. But what happens if your job is to talk about those three things? Well, let's find out. Joining me today in the Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics is former ambassador to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, John Cotton Richmond. The ambassador is a graduate of Mary Washington University and the Wake Forest School of Law. Thereupon, he began his career at the International Justice Mission, or IJM, a Christian non-governmental organization that focuses on combating human trafficking. He lived in India for 3 years with IJM. He then worked as a trial attorney with the Justice Department's storied Civil Rights Division, where he prosecuted hate crimes, police misconduct, and human trafficking. And Mr. Ambassador, I'll tell you later about interviewing for a job at this section you worked at many, many years ago. Getting back to your bio, after working as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, he became a special litigation counsel with the Justice Department, where he spent 10 years prosecuting human trafficking cases, again, on a national scale. John then founded the Human Trafficking Institute, an NGO that assisted the government with its battle against human trafficking. He then was appointed to the U.S. State Department as the U.S. Ambassador to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, a presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed position he held over 2 years. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for your time.
It's great to be with you today.
You come highly recommended by another ambassador friend of mine, Morris Tand, who is a recent Wheaton grad.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for Ambassador Tand's service. He was our ambassador for global criminal justice, focusing on issues of atrocities, genocide, and crimes against humanity. He did a fantastic job. Sounds like there may have been some overlap in interest there. Absolutely. Fortunately, there's 6 ambassadors at large, and we were able to engage and work with each other while we were at the State Department. So I see from your bio, you started doing anti-human trafficking work early in your career. What first piqued your interest in this righteous line of work? I feel like it found me more than I found it. I had been practicing law in a firm for about 4 years, paid off all of our school loans, my wife and I. And International Justice Mission was looking for a lawyer to go to India and start thinking through, how do we identify modern trafficking victims? How do we help governments bring those protections of law to help to protect them? And how do we care for them? And we had always dreamt about trying to live outside the United States for a season. This seemed like a wonderful way to go do it. And IJM was tiny and small at the time. They were willing to take a risk on me, and I'm really glad they did. Yeah, no, living outside the U.S. makes you really appreciate the U.S. I lived in Panama for about 8 years as a kid, and as much as I liked it there, I always really loved coming back home. Tell me about living in India back in the early 2000s. Well, what was it like? India is a captivating place. I loved it there. We had our daughter was 15 months old when we moved there. Our second child, our son, was born in India. And living in India was, it just put all of your senses on alert. The sounds, the cadence, the smells, the working with folks. I love the people. My friends in India, my coworkers that came alongside and did this work are real heroes, and watching them catch an imagination for what it would look like to seek justice as part of our vocation was really, really meaningful. It's a special place. I think some parts of me feel like I could live there forever. But after 3 years, the opportunity to return to Washington, D.C. and begin this work on a larger scale presented itself, and we thought we should take it. So has the problem grown, the problem of human trafficking, that is, grown or diminished since you first began working in the area? That's a really thoughtful question, and one that I don't think anyone can effectively answer. We don't have good measurement around this. And this is an area where the anti-trafficking field needs to mature. We've been driven by anecdote and emotion for most of the 20 years that we've been engaged in this work. And those emotions are meaningful. Those anecdotes I've been a part of. So I don't mean to diminish those, but I think we need to add to them metrics, data, and scholarship. And I think hopefully we'll be doing that. The best global estimate of trafficking that we have is that there are 24.9 million victims of forced labor and sex trafficking around the world, which means that there are more victims today than were trafficked during all 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade. And so the problem is huge, but we don't have great metrics about whether it's growing or whether our interventions are being effective in diminishing it. My worry is that it's growing. And I think there's anecdotal information to support that. But it would be great to have solid data behind it as well.
Sure. So 24 million people, that's about the size of the entire state of Florida. So we're talking a huge number of people.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah.
And can you describe the different types of human trafficking?
Yeah, it really breaks down into a couple of different categories. What most people think of is sex trafficking. That is controlling someone, selling access to their bodies in commerce to sex buyers. But there are other types of trafficking as well. There's trafficking that's not based on coercion, but based on age. That's trafficking minor children, so people under the age of 18. And where we have children being trafficked, we don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion being used by the trafficker. That is, they cannot legally consent to those commercial sex acts. Another category is forced labor. In fact, most of the victims around the world are labor trafficking victims. That is, they're forced to work in agricultural fields, fishing boats, manufacturing facilities, or domestic workers who are forced to work as nannies and cleaners in individuals' homes. They're coerced through all sorts of different coercive schemes. Sometimes their documents are taken from them, that is, their identity documents or immigration papers. Sometimes their children or friends or family are threatened if they don't comply. Sometimes it's just shame, and sometimes it's sexual violence, as well as beatings that can happen as well. But there are three big categories: sex trafficking by force, fraud, and coercion, the sex trafficking of children, and then forced labor of adults or children.
Now, regarding the forced labor, do most of them come thinking that they're going to have a legitimate job with benefits and reasonable hours? I mean, are they just lied to, or is there a different type of inducement?
Traffickers are incredibly innovative. And so they're always trying to find different ways to recruit and groom their victims. So sometimes it's just what you said. They bait them with the lie of a better job. They bait them with the lie of high pay. One trafficker explained it to me this way. He said, "John, I just find out their dream and I sell them their dream. If their dream is to be loved, I become their boyfriend. If their dream is to have a family, I become a father figure. If their dream is for the future, I sell them that. Their dreams become a model. I tell them I'm a video producer. Whatever it is that they most want, I will try to fraudulently give them."
Wow.
So traffickers are always baiting individuals with lies. And so it's lies about employment, lies: come from your rural village, come work in the big city, things will be better, you can support your family, and then ultimately they can't.
Wow, it sounds so devious. I remember when we both worked for the George W. Bush administration in the early 2000s, I attended a conference in Tampa, Florida. I think it was 2004. And the president spoke at that conference. How many other presidents have addressed the issue?
This is a point that I think we can all take some encouragement from, and that there's been a lot of continuity around this issue. In 2000, we passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is sort of our national law against trafficking. It was signed by President Clinton. He wasn't so much a champion of the issue, but he was happy to sign the law once it was presented to him. And people wondered, would President Bush prioritize this issue since President Clinton signed the law?
Right.
And indeed, President Bush was a great champion of this issue. When I was in the Justice Department during the transition between President Bush and President Obama, the same questions were being asked. That is, would President Obama emphasize trafficking in persons since President Bush had done so? Would he see it as like, this is a priority of the last administration, and therefore I should focus on something else? But President Obama also championed this issue, giving a full-length speech at the Clinton Global Initiative in 2012. passing reauthorizations of the law and expanding the protections. And I'm so grateful to President Obama for doing that. And then the same thing happened when President Trump was elected, and people wondered, would President Trump see this as an Obama era priority? But he didn't. President Trump also prioritized this. Within weeks of being in office, hosting survivors of trafficking and leaders in the anti-trafficking community in the Oval Office, trying to figure out how to make a difference here. So I think one thing that the listeners to your podcast can take away is that this issue occupies rare political real estate in Washington. There are champions on both sides of the aisle for this. And I'm hopeful and looking forward to seeing the Biden administration carrying on that tradition and making this a priority as well.
Absolutely. So most of my career was in criminal law, prosecuted lots of cases at state, federal, military, and defended as well. But I don't remember even hearing the term human trafficking until the Bush administration, although you did mention that it was signed into law by President Clinton. How long has this been a problem?
Well, it's been a problem throughout history. We have 4,000 years of recorded history, and there's almost always been some form of modern slavery or trafficking. We've called it different things. So it's always been there. Obviously, 1865, we had the 13th Amendment to the Constitution that prohibited slavery, but we still have individuals that we have to be vigilant against for committing this crime. So we've torn down the systemic slavery in the United States. We've torn down the institutionally protected or democratically approved aspects of slavery, but we still have individuals that we need to be vigilant against. And so in 2000, we got the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, gave us lots of new tools to do that from a criminal standpoint. We've got new statutes as of 2000 to prosecute both forced labor and sex trafficking. We have strong laws. The question is, are we going to use them?
Right.
And are we going to use them consistently? These are difficult cases to deal with because they're process-based crimes, not event-based crimes. So when there's a bank robbery, everyone's focused on the day the bank robbery occurred, and you work backwards to figure out what happened.
Right.
But trafficking doesn't occur on a specific date. Trafficking occurs as a process. The recruitment, the grooming, the coercion, the coercive scheme can change over time. People can be trafficked for years and years and years. And so it takes a lot of additional work to investigate and gather the evidence necessary.
Yeah. So for our listeners who are typically Wheaton grads or Wheaton students or have some connection with Wheaton, which I'm sure you know from your friendship with Ambassador Tan, was founded by an abolitionist, someone who hated trafficking of Africans in this country in the mid 1800s. But can you tell us again what the name of the federal law is so they can look it up?
Absolutely. It's the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. In the criminal code is codified at 18 USC 1589 for forced labor, 1591 for sex trafficking. There are other provisions, kind of the social services provisions that are codified in other sections of the code. But the act itself is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and it is a model law. It's consistent with the Palermo Protocol, which is the UN protocol against trafficking in persons that was entered into about 6 weeks after the United States law came into effect. And now we have almost every country in the world has some sort of law against trafficking.
So is this law sufficient? Because it sounds like if we enforce it, it might be. Or do you believe we need some amendments and more legislation?
There's always room to improve a law. There's always ways to fiddle with it and make some amendments. But I don't think the big need out there is more laws or newer laws. We're good at passing laws, good at passing resolutions. We wear the right color ribbon on the designated awareness day. I think what we actually need is sort of the shoe leather work of getting out there and implementing.
Yes.
The gap between the ideas and the actual protection seems far too wide. And so more than newer laws and campaigns for that, I think we need people campaigning for specialized investigative units and specialized prosecution units at the state level, as well as at the federal level, focusing on labor trafficking, as well as sex trafficking. We need to do the things that we know will make a difference. And unfortunately, right now, we're not doing it. Worldwide, last year, governments reported identifying 118,000 human trafficking victims.
Oh my.
Now, compare that to the 24.9 million estimate of victims, which means that governments around the world are identifying less than half of 1% of the estimated victims. There's a lot we need to do better.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, but I do recall from the Tampa conference that I attended that human trafficking is called modern day slavery. Do you find that to be an accurate comparison?
It's interesting because there's a big debate right now about what words to use. There's a community of people that feel like we shouldn't say modern day slavery. They worry that it conflates sort of a chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade with what's happening today, that maybe it diminishes what happened historically. Others worry that it creates misconceptions. It makes us think that everyone has to be in chains or shackles, when the reality is a lot of modern victims are not caged. They're not in chains and shackles. They're either controlled through chemicals with drugs and addiction. They're controlled through images and shame. They're controlled through their documents, all sorts of other ways. But then there's a different camp that says, you know what, we should call it what it is. It's always been slavery. It just takes different forms in different eras of history. Supporters of that view include President Obama, who squarely said we should call it modern slavery. The United Kingdom, Australia, they passed modern slavery acts. They've embraced these terms. And so there is a debate about what to call it. I tell you, I care less, though, about what labels we give it and care more about people moving into action to try and end it.
Right.
I think the victims around the world who are suffering right now, who don't get to make the most basic decisions about their lives, when they wake up, where they work, who touches their bodies, I think they would be frustrated with our debates about labels and language and just want help to come.
Right, right. What are the largest source countries? I'm sure there are many, many countries, but what are the largest? We'll say 5.
Well, hands down, the country with the most victims around the world is agreed upon is India. India is got a country with its caste system, with the way that it is structured. It's ripe for traffickers to operate. Most of the victims in India are trafficked right in India. They don't move across borders. So it's both a source and a destination country in a sense. Indian government needs to do a lot more to take this problem seriously. The estimates of the number of folks that are just manipulated by debts and coercion is 8 or 9 million by the Indian government's estimates. They're not doing enough, quite frankly. But other countries are engaged as well. We think about the number of victims that we see migrating at great risk to themselves. We see a lot of Rohingya refugees fleeing both Burma and Bangladesh. We see a lot of migrant workers shifting to the Gulf countries to be domestic workers or construction workers, where the kafala system or the sponsorship visa system makes them easy pickings for traffickers. And we've seen reforms in that area as well, which is incredibly encouraging from some of the Gulf countries. I think we're seeing a lot of movement out of Asia and out of Africa to the Gulf and to Europe, where people are being exploited. But I would just encourage folks to realize that the United Nations has estimated that 71% of victims are trafficked in their country of origin. They're never moved across the border. And so I think we want to make sure that we have an imagination to see victims that are trafficked right in their hometowns by other people from their hometown.
Well, to carry that on, how much of a problem is there within the United States?
I think it's significant. Again, we don't have a national estimate. And I don't actually even think national estimates would be helpful, because the way you would try to capture the folks who are forced to work as seasonal workers in agricultural fields would be very different than boys that are sold for sex. Different types of traffickers, different coercive schemes, different customers. It'd be a little bit like saying, what's the amount of financial crime in the United States, as opposed to that would vary tremendously between securities fraud and a con artist that's hanging out outside an elder home trying to take the folks' money when they're old. Very different types of criminality. It's significant in the sense that everywhere we're looking for it, we're finding it. There is no challenge on that front. There are lots of cases to be done in the United States, and where we have people of goodwill working collaboratively between law enforcement, social service centers, NGOs, departments of labor. We're seeing great task forces pop up around the country where groups are trying to raise awareness and educate people about this crime. And so it's significant. I wish I could put an actual number on it, but unfortunately, we just can't right now.
I understand that. What effect has the global pandemic had on the volume of human trafficking?
Well, one thing is clear is that traffickers have not shut down. Their operations have not been canceled. They are continuing to exploit people. And oftentimes, their victims have been quarantined with their traffickers. Victims haven't been able to reach out, or perhaps victims who are separated from their traffickers, now survivors, they can't get the trauma care that they once were getting because the support groups are not meeting, or they're only meeting on Zoom, or shelters had to socially distance and take less people in. So it's had a huge impact. We've also seen a massive uptick in the amount of child sexual abuse material online. The number of calls to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, as well as the Human Trafficking Hotline, have increased. The government of the Philippines reported seeing a massive spike in the amount of commercial sex being sold online. So online sex trafficking seems to have risen as well. And while everyone is pulling back from delivering government services, traffickers are pushing forward to exploit more people. And so this is a time where we actually need governments to step up and lean in and do their jobs.
Yes. How has your Christian faith informed the work you've done over most of your career now?
You know, I feel like it's just inextricably intertwined with my work. The fundamental philosophical pivot point of all of this is whether we believe that people matter, whether we believe that every person has human dignity, inherent value. And our founding documents say this, that we were endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. One of those is liberty, freedom.
Right.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948 says the same thing, that we have inherent value. That is, rights that precede governments and do not flow from them. And if we believe that everyone matters, and from a faith perspective, it's this idea of imago Dei, right?
Yes.
It's this idea that people are created with the image of God. Every single person. And that's why racism is evil, right? Because everyone is in the image of God. That's why we want to make sure discrimination doesn't exist. When we have that view of the world, it changes the way that we behave. And so just as those things like racism and discrimination are wrong, taking someone's freedom away, selling access to their bodies, taking the fruit of their labor is also evil. And so we come down to this idea of, if we really believe that everyone has inherent value, we are motivated to action and we're motivated to care for them. And I think that is what it looks like for the kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven. That's
right. Let me just draw us to your more recent work as an ambassador at large. What exactly did you do? I mean, I think most of our listeners understand what an ambassador does relative to a particular country, but I think you said there were 6 ambassadors at large. Can you give me an idea of a typical day or a typical week?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because most of us think about ambassadors, we're thinking about ambassadors in residence, an ambassador to a specific place to represent the United States on a wide variety of issues. And then we have 6 ambassadors at large, ambassadors not to a specific place, but to the whole world, but not on all issues, on one specific issue. And in the year 2000, Congress elevated trafficking in persons to the status of having an ambassador at large. And so, a day for me involved bilateral engagement with other countries, trying to assess their trafficking situation, meeting with their leaders, encouraging them to take practical steps to implement their law that would be consistent with their international treaty obligations, as well as consistent with their own domestic laws. It involved multilateral engagement. So working with our multilateral partners and agencies, a lot of great work done by the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, a lot of good work out of the International Labor Organization and the International Organization for Migration. The OSCE is doing amazing things. So working with them. But it also involved, uniquely, domestic efforts around trafficking. So normally at the State Department, all of our efforts are focused internationally. But the Trafficking in Persons Office is the one place within the State Department that also has a domestic mandate. And so part of my job was to lead and support the coordination of the U.S. interagency on trafficking. There's a formalized interagency convening that happens quarterly for 22 federal departments to coordinate their work on trafficking in persons, and to liaise with the White House to make sure that we are implementing U.S. law effectively around the country. And so I spent a lot of my time doing that as well. And then I'd say the fourth category would be engaging this conversation, raising awareness, talking about these ideas, trying to stretch and grow our understanding of what is possible, and trying to keep people focused on this critical issue. It's really one of the most egregious human rights abuses around the world, and it's one in which we can actually do something about.
Marvelous. Do other countries have similar ambassador-at-large positions?
A couple do. There is an ambassador position on trafficking in Sweden. There is a similar position on trafficking and migrant smuggling in Australia. There's a high commissioner for modern slavery in the United Kingdom. And I worked with them on a regular basis, trying to make sure that we are advancing these issues. But I wish more countries would have a nodal office, have a focal point that would really catalyze efforts around this issue.
Can you give me an example of how a case typically gets to the attention of law enforcement in the United States?
Yeah, it varies, as you might imagine. But I can tell you one case from California for years ago. It was United States versus Dan. It was a mom dropping her child off. She'd walk her kid to the elementary school, and she noticed that there was a nanny who was dropping off someone else's kid, and that the woman never spoke. And she tried to engage her in conversation every now and then, but wasn't able to. So this mom started talking to the gardener at the school, the landscaper, and the two of them kind of were just paying attention and watching, noticing this woman, trying to engage her from time to time. They enlisted the help of one of the janitors who was also paying attention. And these three people ultimately realized something's not right. And they just sensed it. They hadn't gone to a course. They didn't have a degree in it. They were just loving their neighbors. Right?
Sure.
They were paying attention to what's going on around them. So they made a phone call to the authorities, and they said, we could be completely wrong, but something feels off here. And investigators rolled up. Turned out she had been a trafficking victim. She was a domestic worker who wasn't free. And ultimately, her traffickers were prosecuted, and she was able to return to her home country, which is all she really wanted to do.
That's
Other
an
times
amazing
it's
story.
people calling a hotline. But it always comes from people just being present where their feet are and looking around and caring about the world around them. And if we do that, we can make wrong things right all over the place, whether it's just picking up a piece of litter, putting it in the rubbish bin, or whether it's calling the authorities to rescue someone from trafficking. That's what it looks like, I think, to be a good neighbor.
That's a great example. And is there a hotline that folks should write down?
There is. So they can go to the web, and there's an organization called Polaris, and Polaris operates the Human Trafficking Hotline for the United States government. And I can give you the number here, and folks, if they want, can just right now, one simple act that they can take is to put this phone number in their phone. They can just save it as a contact. And then if they ever are in a situation where they see something, and they may be wrong, it may be perfectly fine, but it doesn't hurt to call. Here's the number. It's 888-373-7888. So the Human Trafficking Hotline is 888-373-7888. And I can tell you, as someone, when I was a federal prosecutor working cases, I would get emails each day from the folks who run the Human Trafficking Hotline letting me know where potential cases were. And we would fan those out to Homeland Security agents, to FBI agents, to local law enforcement, to try and sort out, are these real cases or are they not? And it's okay when they turn out not to be a case, right? But what we want to make sure is that where there is a victim out there, that they can get help.
Let me ask you this. What's the most memorable case you personally handled involving human trafficking?
I can think of a couple that are really memorable. One was there was an agricultural plantation in South India, and went in with the police. We did this inspection. They were releasing a bunch of victims, and I noticed an old man who was napping underneath a tree. And I went over to him and asked him how he was doing. His name was Narkalapa, and Narkalapa had grown up on that plantation. He was an old man. His job was basically the security guard, but he wasn't really doing security. He had never, ever left that land.
Oh, good grief.
His entire life. He was a victim as well. His grandson was there and got released, and we got Narkalapa a release certificate too. He was freed. So Narkalapa, we took him to the beach. He'd never seen the ocean before. He didn't even know what an ocean was.
Wow.
And watching his eyes light up to the world that he missed for his entire lifetime. But now getting to see his grandson become free. His grandson, interestingly, ended up getting his motorcycle license, learning to drive, getting to go to school, ended up working at International Justice Mission, and rescued a bunch of other people after that. Another notable case is one out of Chicago, Illinois, where there was a terribly brutal trafficking case that we were trying. But one part that I remember so clearly is that there was a victim who had been writing in her diary. And we found a copy of her diary when we executed the search warrant. We got it translated into English, and she read it to the jury as part of our case in chief. And what she was writing the day before the federal agents went in and found her, she wrote, "Why is this happening to me? Why am I being treated like a slave?" That was the word she used.
Wow.
Like, what have I done wrong? My life I have no future. And she said, "God, please rescue me. God, I need you." And what she did not realize, and what the agents didn't realize as we were planning our operation, was that those federal agents were her answer to prayer.
Yes.
And I think, like, when we think about vocation, as students at Wheaton or alumni of Wheaton are thinking about how they can live out their faith, they can live it out as federal law enforcement agents. They can live it out as forensic accountants. They can live it out in the halls of Congress if they want to run for office, but they can also do it as teachers and nurses and doctors and coders who are helping us find things online. There are so many ways to live vocationally. And there was not a dry eye in that jury box as she explained what happened to her. And we called her by her name because the traffickers have always done this. They try and change people's names. If you remember Alex Haley's iconic book and miniseries Roots,
sure,
the inflection point of that narrative was that the slave Kunta Kinte, who had just been brought from West Africa, didn't want his name to be changed to Toby. The slave master wanted to strip him of his identity, his heritage, his culture, his family, everything that he knew, and he would not submit. He basically said, "You can take my body, but I am never giving up my identity. I'm never giving up my name." For this victim, she didn't want to give up her name either. And it was amazing to watch her sit back, shoulder square, this look of confidence as the trafficker who had told her to shut up and that no one would ever listen to her and that she didn't have any value to bring. That trafficker had to sit quietly while she spoke her voice out, and everyone in court was listening to her, flipping the script on the trafficker, saying that she actually matters.
Yes.
It was amazing, amazing moment.
Well, I can see why you'll never forget that. And it's funny you're talking about Roots, because I saw that as a freshman here at Wheaton College many years ago. But my wife and I just saw it a year ago, and it really had a higher impact as an adult than it did as an 18-year-old. I mean, what an incredible masterpiece that was. What does the United States have to do to end human trafficking as a problem?
Now, I think there are a couple of practical things that we can do. The one is a super effective intervention that is underutilized is having specialized investigative units. We know how to do this. Every time we care about something, we create a specialization. So we have bankruptcy courts, family law courts, drug courts. We have homicide units. We break things up. We need specialized labor trafficking investigative units if we are going to identify more labor cases. It's the problem of the added task, right? Where everyone's already busy. They've got a million things to do. And we say, okay, in addition to all the work you're currently doing, we also want you to focus on trafficking. Added tasks never get done. We need to switch that out and make finding trafficking cases the primary task of law enforcement, where they're looking for these cases. And the way they get promoted, the way they get reviewed at the end of the year, the way they get the next patch on the uniform is to have found more cases. I think that's a really helpful intervention. We also need shelters. We need great, thoughtful, individualized care plans for survivors where we can walk with them through the healing process as they try to re-enter. And that takes a long time. It takes a lot longer than it does to do the criminal aspect of prosecuting a trafficker. Trauma is a difficult and complicated event, and we've got to make sure that we can care for people well as they come through that. And then I think we need to think about prevention. And how do we actually prevent this crime from occurring by, one, making it risky for the traffickers, but also disabling and changing the systems that make it so easier for traffickers to operate. And I think if we work on these three things, prosecution, protection, and prevention, we'll have some success.
Absolutely. One question that just came to mind is the legal status of the trafficked person. Are they protected from deportation? I mean, how does that work once they have been found out and once the trafficker is being prosecuted? What happens to the victims?
Really thoughtful question. So we've got two solutions to it. And I honestly think the United States has a fantastic approach to this. It's just underutilized. So we've got two pieces. One is continued presence immigration status. And that is available to victims of trafficking while their trafficker is being prosecuted. It allows them to stay in the country legally, allows them to get a work permit. It is given by law enforcement for the benefit of the investigation, but it has a huge benefit to the survivor. In addition to continued presence, though, we also have a self-petitioning T visa. And they tell me that the T didn't stand for trafficking. It was just the next letter in the code, but I somehow think it was probably for trafficking. So the T visa allows a survivor to petition for a special visa to stay in the country because they're here on account of their trafficking. It allows them to bring in relatives because obviously if we're going to support a survivor, they actually need their community. They need family with them. So we have derivative T visas available. Our challenge isn't that we don't have the right system to protect and care for survivors who don't have immigration status. I think the problem is that we're not using it. We actually cap the number of T visas every year in this country at 5,000. Congress wanted to make sure there wouldn't be like abuse and a run on T visas. We have never issued more than 700 or 800 in a year. Oh my. Nowhere close to the 5,000 number cap. Mm-hmm. And we've seen a slowing down. Over the last several years, there have been fewer T visas issued. And so we want to make it easy for people to get these visas so that we can care for them. Could there be abuse in the system? Perhaps one day, but we haven't seen any yet. And the numbers don't suggest that it's being abused. But what we want to do is be quick to help. We want to be quick to let people stay so that we can make sure that they get the care they need and we can stop the traffickers.
Absolutely. Final question. Is there anything I should have asked you but did not?
You should have asked me to come visit Wheaton. I'd love to be there with you. One thing I would say is that there's a lot of reason for hope. I think people, when they think about trafficking, it can feel really dark and really heavy.
Yes.
And it is. There's no doubt about it. But there's also so much hope. And if I could just offer an argument for hope in this space. We were talking about the fact that it's been 4,000 years of history where we've seen some type of human trafficking. It's been called different things, but on every inhabited continent, from the Greeks, the Romans, the Hebrews, the Aztecs, the Incas, Indians, China, there's been slavery.
Yes.
Until about 220 years ago. Because in all these places, slavery was democratically approved. It was lawful. It was what the king or the empire decreed to be legal. And then 220 years ago, we saw a group of friends in Clapham, England, led by William Wilberforce, who in 1807 had the wisdom to end the transatlantic slave trade. And then slowly, the United States did. But here's what's amazing. In the last 220 years, every single country in the world now passed a law saying that this is wrong, that we should no longer have it. This used to be a religiously condoned practice. And in 2014, there was a gathering at the Vatican of world leaders from all variety of religions. And all these leaders said together that their sacred texts no longer should be used to support slavery.
Wow.
We've had a massive shift. If you think about those timelines of history that we used in middle school to try to plot things out, imagine this long, expansive 4,000 years. And just this last little sliver, this last little 220, we've seen a complete change in the legal landscape, a complete change in what is considered culturally acceptable around this. And now we just need that last yard of cable. We need that last section that says we're going to take these parchment protections of law and extend them to the people who need help. And that's what our generation gets to be about and do. And so I think there's a lot of reason for hope.
Well, it's inspiring to Christians to know that it took the Clapham sect and a member of parliament who was a Christ follower, William Wilberforce, who didn't give up when his legislation failed. He just kept at it for, how many years was it? 15, 20 years? I mean, it was
the work of his lifetime. He was a great model of persistence. The law actually got passed just a day or so before he passed away.
Right.
And they rode on horseback. They sprinted to tell him the good news that the slave trade would be ended. And that was 1807. And then in 1833, England actually emancipated all of its slaves. It took time.
Yes.
The world has been slow to do what's right, but I'm inspired by the line that Martin Luther King penned, where he said that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
Yeah, that's a beautifully biblical concept. Well, Ambassador Richmond, I want to thank you for your time. And I will invite you live, because we expect to have visitors live in the fall, to guest lecture in my Faith in the Capitol House course. And I'll send you more information offline, okay?
I look forward to it.
Thank you.
You have been listening to Wheaton's Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics podcast. 3 Things with host David Iglesias. Join us again in 2 weeks for a new interview with an accomplished faith, political, and business leader.